Hello and welcome to the Read to Inspire podcast. I am Sibongiseni Mkolozeli, and this evening, or depending on where you are in the world, I am joined by an author of a book called the Love Jones Cohort, Single and Living Alone in the Black Middle Class. Her name is Dr. Kris Marsh. Just a brief information about her. She is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. Previously, Professor Marsh was a postdoctoral fellow or scholar at the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina, a visiting researcher at the University of Southern California, and Fulbright scholar in my home country, South Africa, at the University of Witwatersrand and the University of Johannesburg. Professor Marsh's area of expertise are the Black middle class, demography, racial residential segregation, and education. Just before we get into the book, I would like to say these few things. Basically, as a podcast, we basically try to help the authors to market and promote their books through these one-on-one interviews. That's our main goal. But our mission really is to promote the reading culture within the African continent and beyond, because we believe that reading is the absolute best foundation ever if you want to be successful in any area of your life. So I'm excited. Again, I think this is the first American who is joining us in this podcast. So I'm excited about that. But before we talk about the book, I would like to welcome Dr. Marsh. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Read to Inspire podcast.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here to talk about your book. And I'm so excited to know that I'm the first American. I do hope that I'm not last.
Definitely you are not last. Let's get into the book. Where do I start? Maybe I can ask your core reason as to why did you write this book in particular, and what are you hoping to achieve through your book?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And for me in America, and I'm writing from the American perspective, but the conversation, the dialogue, the discussion has universal appeal. Whether or not you're in South Africa, whether or not you're in Germany, whether or not you're in Los Angeles, this whole conversation about singleism is something we need to talk more about. And so my main reason for writing the book is that I wanted to destigmatize singlehood.
Yeah.
You have so many people that don't want to hold the title of single because they think it's stigmatizing, that they're willing to be in relationships that are oppressive, toxic, unfulfilling, and even abusive because they simply don't want to hold the title of single. So that was like my main premise for writing the book. One of the things I really hope comes out of the book is that we move the conversation of singlehood beyond just why aren't you partnered and why don't you have any children. I talk a lot in the book of 62 respondents. We talk about what lifestyles they are living, what they are doing. So it moves the conversation away from why aren't you married and why don't you have any children to what are you doing and how are you navigating. That part of the conversation is not there. This part on why you don't have children is so overdone. And so the book really is trying to broaden the conversation and talk about how people that are single are living their lifestyles.
Absolutely. I got that from the book. And maybe since I know that your book is an academic book, you shed some light briefly in your comment just now. I wanted to find out, maybe someone else is curious who maybe have heard somewhere, maybe in your social media platforms, that this is an academic book. When you start maybe a research, there's always something called a research question or a problem statement. If I can ask for your research for this book specifically, what was the problem statement that you have noticed in your research and maybe the rationale or justification to do the research and to write the book?
Right. So that's a great question. And my broad research question is, how do single Black folks live their lives? Because again, it gets to the point of the conversation always ends at, well, you don't have children and you aren't married. Therefore, you're invisible. You don't matter. You're pushed into the other category. And so what I really am trying to do is talk about how they are living their lifestyles. And since I've written the book, there's two compliments that I get. The first one is that they've learned something. It is an academic book, so you're going to learn something along the way. I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, so you're going to learn something. But so many people have said, thank you. I feel like I've been seen for the very first time. So I simply wanted to ask a very simple question about their lifestyles. How are you living your lifestyles? And I think sometimes as scholars, we want to have this really big, advanced 3-part, 5-part research question. And sometimes there's beauty in the simplicity. And I think that this book really, in some ways, is very simplistic, but it has a lot of large implications that you have to think about, and you have to think about in very critical kind of ways. But the very basic kind of question is like, how are singles living their lives? And I think the other part too is because a lot of times it becomes a deficit model. You don't have children, you don't have husbands, you don't have wives, you don't have partners. Therefore, we're looking at you in a certain way. I'm trying to cast a different light on singles and look at their lifestyles from a very different perspective. And the book does in fact do that.
Absolutely, I agree. Maybe for our viewers to have a more context or better understanding of what we are talking about when we say simplicity, we can start by dissecting each and every phrase in the title, because it differentiates between the Love Jones cohort and the Salah for single and living alone, and then the Black middle class. So you are not very broad, you are very specific in terms of who you are addressing. So maybe take us briefly, like the differentiation between the first part. Is it the same as being the Love Jones? Is it safe to say if we are single and living alone, you belong to the Love Jones cohort?
Okay, so it's really great. And it's funny because the title is based on a movie that you may or may not have seen, but it's called Love Jones. It's called Love Jones. And it came out 26 years ago. And the reason why I decided to name the book Love Jones is because when we think of like the quintessential or the typical Black middle class family in the US, people probably defer to the Huxtables on the Cosby Show. You have a mother, a father, 5 beautiful children. But then you started to see this kind of demographic shift in movies and in sitcoms where you started to see young Black professionals who weren't married and don't have any children. Love Jones is one of the pivotal media outlets where we started to see this demographic of young professionals who weren't married, don't have any children. So I wanted to pay respect and homage to the pioneers on the media side who actually started to move away from this normal, traditional marriage kind of family to this now young Black professional. So I decided to call the book The Love Jones. And then cohort. Cohort is nothing more than a demographic term that means a band of people. So that's the title, but the subtitle is where you really get the context. I want us to look at people that were single and living alone in the Black middle class. And so when I talk about single, what I'm talking about in the book is people who have never been married and they're not living with a romantic partner. You can be in the household with someone else, but it's not a romantic partner. And I also wanted to look at people who were Black and middle class, because one of the things I decided early on in my academic career is that I say this all the time. I said, I am not going to pimp the poor to make my academic career. Whether or not you're in America, whether or not you're in the US, and whether or not you even read the Bible, and the Bible talks about how the poor will be with us for all time. No matter where you sit in the conversation, poor people are here and they're here to stay. However, I wanted to look at people who, quote unquote, did everything right. They went to college, they got the big degrees, they got the big houses, but their outcomes still look different than other people's outcomes. So there is a Black middle class. There's a small Black middle class in the US. There's a small Black middle class in South Africa, but there is a middle class there. And I think what happens, unfortunately, is people sometimes think once you're Black and middle class, you've arrived. And so you don't have any issues to deal with. I'm like, no, it's a different set of issues, but you still have issues to deal with. So I wanted to make sure and talk about those who had, quote unquote, done everything right, but still just weren't married and didn't have any children or weren't partnered, because it's a really important conversation. So that's how the entire title came to be. And you don't have to be Black, you don't have to be middle class, you don't have to be American to read the book. Anybody who picks up the book will learn something and glean something out of it. Now, the one nuance is that when I'm talking about Sala, single and living alone, Sala households, that's just who's in the household with you. That does not have any economic implications to it. When you are Sala, and middle class, you're then become the Love Jones cohort. So for the Love Jones, you have to be middle class and solid. So I want to make that clarification.
Oh,
But anybody
thank you.
can use the title. I'm just telling you how I use it. I don't have a monopoly on a title. Anybody can use it.
Okay. While still speaking about the title, I think some people, they may misinterpret the book, or you for that matter, as being someone who's against marriage or relationships in general. I know in the book you even say you have faced a backlash, especially from the Black community, and therefore, and those not Black community and those who are basically pro-marriage. But you reiterate in the book that you are not anti-marriage or even not anti-children. My question is to you, maybe you can clarify more on this. What did you hope to achieve or to educate our people through this research or your work?
Yes, and I appreciate you for saying that, because I do get hate emails and stuff that says I'm bad for Black America. And so I was on a radio show in South Africa, and someone called in. 90% of the people were very positive. One person called in and said, "Don't bring those westernized views. We want our young girls to get married." Somebody else came up on top of that listener and said, "We need to have this conversation about how some of these relationships are oppressive, and we have gender-based violence at a high. So we need to have these conversations." Here's what I'm trying to do. And I want to say it again. I appreciate you saying it, but I want to say it too. I am not anti-marriage. I am not anti-Black love, but I am anti-oppressive, toxic, abusive relationships, simply to hold the title of relationship or to check a box to say you're partnered and or you're married. Okay, I'm anti that. I will always be anti that. So what I'm really trying to get people to understand is that we need to broaden the parameters of what Black love looks like. It doesn't have to be this heteronormative husband, wife, 2.5 children, and a Black picket fence. We can have love between an individual. You could also have love between friends, non-romantic, nurturing relationships. But what happens is that we put all of our eggs in the marriage basket, and everybody is either pushed to try to be married or everybody wants to be married, and they neglect and they undervalue and they ignore their non-romantic, nurturing relationships, what I'm calling friends. And it's really important that when you say you want to be in a relationship, you have to clarify what kind of relationship you want to be in, because you may not have a romantic relationship, but we have a ton of non-romantic, nurturing relationships that can give us some of the things we need in these romantic relationships. So I'm just trying to get us to think more critically about the term relationship and the term marriage and the term family and what that actually means.
Absolutely. And it's very clear for someone who's maybe, as you're explaining, they need more details. In the book, you did it so beautifully in terms of explaining in details about what you mean. Let's move on to the part now of the status or the class. I must say, I learned this term for the first time in your book, basically the differentiation between Black middle class and the talented 10th. I didn't know what it means to be the talented 10th. Can you maybe differentiate or maybe define, if possible, the difference between these two terms?
Oh, great. Yes. And I want to talk a little bit about like the structure of the book when I give my answer. So in America, there was a scholar named W.E.B. Du Bois. And in basic terms, one of the arguments that he makes is that 10% of the Black population are going to improve the life chances of the entire Black population. So this is like the Black elite, or the talented 10th, as W.E.B. Du Bois called them. W.E.B. Du Bois even pushed back on his own idea years later. But what's really interesting about the respondents, because the respondents brought up the idea of the talented 10th and whether or not they thought the Black middle class represented the talented 10th. But they did not talk about other people that were talking about uplifting all of Black America. So when you buy the book, one of the things you have to do, I would admonish you to do, is to read the footnotes, because some really interesting comments and context is in the footnotes, or listen to the book, because the audiobook comes out on August 8th. So when you listen, I negotiated with the publisher of the audiobook to make sure the footnotes were read, because there's interesting stuff. So the talented 10th is one idea, but there was another scholar at the very same time as W.E.B. Du Bois that was writing. And what they were saying is that if you improve the life chances of Black women, a groundswell, you'll improve the life chances of everybody. So let's think about it from the Black woman's perspective. But that was a Black female scholar named Anna Julia Cooper. But Anna Julia Cooper couldn't get a lot of her research published because she was a Black woman, and there were gatekeepers that were preventing her work from getting published. One of the gatekeepers, unfortunately, was W.E.B. Du Bois. And so me as a Black female scholar, there's no way I could talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. I had to be sensitive to the literature, because to the respondents, they talked about W.E.B. Du Bois. But then I, as a Black female scholar, had to make sure that I also acknowledged Anna Julia Cooper. So you have to read the footnotes to find out more about Anna Julia Cooper. But I also have a big section in the book that talks about class versus status. And so that's a very interesting conversation. Scholars have been arguing this, trying to figure this out for years. And thank God we haven't figured it out yet. So I'll still have a job for years to come to figure out how we think about class or status. So in a very basic kind of term, when we say like middle class, those are usually some objective measures, like how much money you make, how much income you have, like what if you have homes or assets. They're objective measures. When we talk about status, those are subjective measures, like what organizations you belong to, how manicured is your front lawn. And I think it's important when we think about the middle class, the Black middle class in particular, that we might think about having an amalgamation of both measures. To only have these objective measures, I think one gives us a white gaze and a white lens. And it ignores the fact that in some ways there's so much racism and gendered racism in these objective measures that we want to have some kind of subjective measure that gets us at understanding middle class a little bit better. But I would like for you to read the book and tell me if you agree with my arguments, or you think it should only be objective, it should only be subjective, or should it be an amalgamation of both? But when we say middle class, we typically are talking about objective measures.
Absolutely. And maybe someone else might be curious, because we're talking about middle class or maybe status. What would you say education fit into between these objective or subjective measures?
Where does education?
Yes. So would you say it falls under class or status?
So either you have a degree or not. That falls under class. I would put that under class. Yes.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, your occupation, either you have a professional occupation or you don't. That would go under class. If you have if you're making 150 Rand, that would go under class, because those are like objective measures. Those are like, you can just kind of check the box on whether or not you have those. Status is something a little bit different, and status can change. I can have status in one context, but in the very next context, I don't have the same status.
Oh, I get you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And in your introduction, you mentioned, I think it's all about the lifestyle, right? What I got from your book in terms of, these Love Jones cohorts. But I found these central five central factors. How do they call them? 5 central lifestyle factors of the Love Jones cohort. Can you maybe take us through them briefly? And maybe if we still have more time, we'll just dive deeply into each and every one of them. But for now, let's just look at them briefly and then see if we can be able to finish them all.
And I would love to say that I remember all 5 of them. So I'm going to try really hard to see if I can remember all 5. You might have to help me if I forget. So one of the things I really wanted to know is I wanted to figure out how the Love Jones cohort defined middle class. Yeah. And the reason being is because I wanted to see, even though they weren't partnered and didn't have any children, did they still think middle class had to be partnered and with children? Because there's a subtle argument in the social science literature that says, hey, to be middle class, you have to have like a husband, a wife, a partner. And I'm like, no, these people are solid middle class members and don't have that. And the demographics are changing across the globe. Singlehood is on the rise. So I think before you needed to be middle class, and maybe you needed to be married to maybe achieve middle class status. But there's a lot of people that are now middle class without being married. So I wanted to know if the Love Jones cohort understood that. I also wanted to know how they thought about family and how they thought about their friends. And it was consistent across the board. Friends played a central role in how they decided to be, how they navigated their singleness. I also wanted to think about when they decided to acquire wealth. So you think about it in a very traditional kind of sense. You go to college, you get married, you have kids, you buy a house, blah, blah, blah. So you have people that have skipped a couple of stations on the life course. So when do they decide to accumulate wealth? Are they deciding, in other words, are they buying homes? Are they starting businesses? Or are they waiting for their partner before they actually do that? And a lot of the cohort were buying homes, living very middle-class lives. They had acquired wealth, which gets to the next section, which talks about how are you going to disseminate your wealth? Who are you going to give your wealth to? In the social science literature, it's really clear. You usually transfer your wealth status or your class status from parent to child and or to your spouse. If you don't have a spouse and you don't have children, who are you going to give your wealth to? It becomes a really interesting conversation. And I wanted to navigate that with the respondents to figure out how they think about navigating their wealth and disseminating their wealth. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about the coping, how they cope with being single. One of the things we know is that being single is stigmatized. I asked people in the book, it's like, who's more stigmatized, men or women, younger or older? And it was a really interesting conversation, but there is a stigma associated with being single. So I wanted to know how they cope with it. And I want to be balanced in my assessment of the book. Most people were really happy with their singlehood. They're like, some people were like, I want to get married, but I'm not willing to settle. So I'm going to just go ahead and enjoy my single life while I can. There were some people that talked about being like situational loneliness is what I called it. They weren't like chronic loneliness in the sense that they were in the bed, covers up over their head, and they were in the fetal position for months on end. No, nobody in the cohort was like that. But there were some people that talked about being situationally lonely, and usually around like major holidays, like Valentine's Day is a big holiday in America, or maybe even like New Year's Eve, where you're always supposed to have someone to kiss. So those are like a couple of days out of the year where they kind of feel lonely. But they also talked about how their friends really help them navigate and help them get through their situational loneliness. So those are like the major parameters of I think hopefully those are the major parameters of the book, the 5 pillars I was really trying to address, because again, it gets to my larger conversation about, okay, I'm so tired and exhausted from having this conversation. Why aren't young, professional, usually Black women getting married? Let's talk about what they are doing. Let's flip the conversation. And so I want to talk about their lifestyles. I chose those 5 pillars of their lifestyles to discuss.
Thank you. Maybe the last one in one of the 5 pillars is about articulating the ebbs and flows of being Black and middle class. I think I enjoyed the responses of your subjects when you asked them different questions. And maybe what were some of the highlights, or maybe from their responses, what were your concluding remarks? What did you make after dissecting the answers of your interviewees?
So yeah, that's great. So the ebbs and flows of being Black and middle class. I forgot that one. Be like, okay, yes. And I think we're trying to figure. So one of the things, and the reason why I wanted to look at that chapter is because the book is kind of comes from the theoretical framework of intersectionality. In the most basic kind of sense, it's not that I'm Black and woman, but I am a Black woman. So we have to understand the world through my lens. And we need research that takes more of an intersectional lens. Don't make me pick between my Blackness and my womanness, because they're both are interconnected. So there's also this notion of this matrix of domination that relates to intersectionality. And my colleague, Patricia Hill Collins, actually kind of coined this term. And she talks about in this matrix of domination, you have race, class, and gender. So there's something to be said about being a poor Black woman. So I'm arguing like in the book that it should be race, class, gender, and singleism in the matrix of domination. And I thought I was going to get a lot of pushback. I thought people were going to say, are you suggesting that racism is as oppressive as singleism? And singleism is as oppressive as racism. And I'm not suggesting that. But what I am suggesting is that when we really take a critical step back and look at social institutions push us to being partnered and push us to being married. So singleism, or discrimination against singles, permeates every single social institutions, as does racism. So it's important for us to think about how single Black folks navigate being Black and single in this entire context. So that's why I wrote the ebb and flow one. But to the point that you were making, I think the book, there were 2 things that I thought there were 1,000 things, but things that have me thinking, have me up at night still thinking. I decided to include men in my book. I interviewed 62 people, and I think 40-something of them were women, and there were 20-something were men. So women definitely dominated the category. And so I could have written a book just about women, but I chose not to. And I'm so glad that I did not, because I saw some gender differences. And so what I noticed, like from the gender perspective, is that Black women were hopeful that they would get married at some point in time, but they weren't willing to settle. They were living their lives if it didn't happen. But the Black men just said it was a matter of time before they get married. And so I look at that, I keep wondering, like, what does that mean for the Black men? Are you just choosing anybody? Are you just choosing the lesser of two evils or three evils or four evils? Are you just kind of in some ways just like settling? And are women, how do women navigate through this process of knowing that they're just being selected because a man's getting older and they want somebody to take care of him in their older age? So that still leaves me up at night thinking, like, what does that mean for Black men? And I want Black men, at some point, have a conversation with them and then kind of tease that out a little bit. But the other thing that was really interesting to me in the book, again, is how important friends were to their existence. It's baffling to me that people are like, oh, I'm kind of struggling right now. I don't have a lot of money. If I can just get married. I'm like, why do people think marriage is the panacea or the cure to all of your ills? Yeah. And people also think just because you're married, your partner is going to show up for you. And I think what we do is we underestimate our non-romantic nurturing relationship. Your friends will show up for you. Your partners, you're at a 50-50 chance whether or not they're going to show up for you. And the women in the cohort, they really talked about how they have and they value non-romantic nurturing relationships. The men did not say that to the same degree as the women did. In fact, some of the men said, if I have like a non-romantic nurturing relationship with another man, people might think I'm gay or people might think that I'm soft. So one of the things that kind of caught me a little off guard, and one of the things I really hope comes out of the book is that we can normalize non-romantic nurturing relationships and we can value those and we can put a lot of energy and effort into those because you have everything out there. You got these online sources, you got these dating apps and everything. You can find a partner, but what about just cultivating friendships? Just really good long-term friendships. So that's something else that kind of caught me off guard, that the men were just like, we just absolutely don't have that. So I hope the book allows the men to develop these non-romantic nurturing relationships.
I see. And maybe in terms of singlehood, I think in the book you also mentioned there's a kind of stigma associated with it, especially from the society. There are so many factors demographically that comes into play, politics, you name them. Maybe how long do you think it will take for the community, not only in Black community, not only in America, but anywhere else in the world, for us to get rid of that stigma, basically? Because I think one of the objectives that your book is trying to achieve is basically to do away with that stigma of being, single and living alone.
Yes. So I'm hopeful that it'll come. It's coming. So two compliments that I usually get is that they learned something and they've been seen in the book. Those are the two compliments. And then I've heard people say, I'm starting a movement away from like having to be married and partner to celebrating and bannerizing our singleness. So but here's what's interesting though, and I admit it, it's not easy to always have these conversations. I think our thinking of being partnered or married is like albatross, or it's deeply ingrained. We've been conditioned from a very young age. So to offer an alternative, and I'm saying marriage is great, beautiful, but to offer additional narrative to that or offer alternatives, it is so hard because people are like, oh, no, we should be married, we should be partnered. I was like, if you're going to say that, please say you should be in partnered and married with good partnerships and good marriage. Don't just be in these partnerships for the sake of being in these partnerships. And men, women, boy, girl, they just don't. They think like, I just have to be married, so I'm willing to take anything. The book gives you another voice. It gives you more context. I also think what's one of the really important parts of the book too is that I'm trying to get people to understand that structural forces constrain our personal choices. It's really important to understand this is like people that are especially within Black America and Blacks, not just America, but the global South or global Blacks.
Yeah.
We have to understand that structural forces constrain our personal choices. So what I mean by that, structural forces constrain personal choices. This is not an individual conversation. You can't just look at this person and say, oh, you're single. What's wrong with you? I was like, oh, you're just an angry Black woman, or you just don't know how to treat a man. You don't know how to be submissive, all that nonsense. It's important to understand how structural forces have constrained personal choices. So if I, Kris Marsh, want to marry another Black man, heterosexual Black man with a PhD who owns a piece of property, who makes 150,000 Rand a year and has estate planning, he's just not there. And so then you're going to look at me and think something's wrong with me because I'm single, but it's a structural conversation that you're overlaying on me and saying that I individually have done something wrong. So I think once we start to really understand how it's structural, I think we'll be more embracive of people that are single, but it's going to take a little while because the default is you got to be married, you got to have children, da, 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 da. And I think marriage is a good thing, but it has to be done the right way.
Absolutely. And you said it so beautifully, and I don't want to mess up your words, but I want us to come to the fact that, there were some comparisons between people's well-being and happiness in general between the married or the divorced and those who decided not to get divorced, or the singles. And maybe who do you think is more happier? Of course, I know this discussion went into details in the book to explain. Who do you think in general, let's say for the people who think, if you decide to stay single for the rest of your life, you'll be miserable, you'll be a terrible person, and so forth and so forth. But yet on the other side, even in marriage, we hear these stories, people fighting, and sometimes the divorce turns ugly and so forth and so forth. But generally, based on your research, which one tends to be more happier?
Right. So I draw from the respondents, and I'm also drawing from one of my colleagues' work. One of my colleagues wrote a book, my colleague who does work on singlehood. He wrote a book called Happy Singlehood. And one of the arguments that he's kind of making in his book is that people that are long-term never married tend to be happier than people that are returning back to singlehood. So someone who's never been married and long-term never married versus someone that's used to be married, but now they're single again. And the reason why that the argument that is the case is because the never married people, as they age, they have friends and they built a network. They have somebody that they can go to church with, someone that they can go to brunch with, someone that they can go play golf with. But married people tend to put all of their eggs in the married basket, and they don't cultivate their outside friendships. So they don't find they don't imagine themselves coming back to singlehood. But when they do, they have forsaken all of their friendships and all of their network. So now they're not happy because they feel like so incredibly isolated. So the argument can be made, whether or not you're single or married, you want to make sure that you have a set of friends and a network outside of the person that you're partnered with. Because I also think it's really exhausting for your partner to be your everything. So we're supposed to be your partner. We're supposed to be the administrators. We're supposed to be your lover. We're supposed to be your therapist. Get yourself some friends. Don't put all of that on one person. That's way too much for one person. So I think it's really important that we think about how we keep friends or cultivate friendships outside of relationships. And unfortunately, I think what people think is that, once I get married, my husband, my wife, my partner has to be my everything. And I'm like, no, that's not how it should be at all. You want to make sure you have a network of friends that you can draw from different things, and then come back to your partnership with your husband, your wife, your partner. And it's going to even strengthen it that much more. The other thing that was really funny too was like stigma. Again, who's more stigmatizing? That was a really interesting chapter. It was really hard section of the book. It was really hard for me to write because I couldn't put a pulse on who was more stigmatized, men or women, older or younger women versus older women. What I did find out is that everybody is stigmatized. If you're single, you're stigmatized. It doesn't matter if you're young, you're old, you're male, female. There's a certain stigma that is associated with being single. And I hope the book really pushes hard back against that stigma.
Thank you, Doc. And maybe one last question related to the book is basically maybe something that is burning that you wish anyone, maybe the viewer, would like to know that we haven't covered yet in this conversation.
Yes. So one of the things this is where I get most of my pushback in the book. One of the things that I'm arguing, let's go back. If you buy my argument that I said that structural forces constrain personal choices, I think we need to, and it's just a conversation, something to think about. It's a thought exercise. Should we redefine family? If we think about the way in which family is defined now, especially like in the US context, family is defined by someone that you're related to by blood, marriage, or adoption. So I, Kris Marsh, don't have anybody in the house that I'm related to by blood, marriage, or adoption. So by definition standards, I cannot be considered a family. I can be the Marsh household, but I can't be considered family. Let me tell you where I think that that's insidious. So if you believe that structural forces constrain personal choices, and then you don't allow me to be defined as a family, you could be discriminating against me in plain sight. So for example, like in America, if you want to buy, like you can have like a family cell phone plan where you get discounted rates when you have more than one cell phone. I want a discounted rate on my one cell phone. I don't have a family, but I want a discount. I want the Marsh family plan, single family plan. I want the discount on that. Thinking about double occupancy versus single occupancy. I'm actually on my way to South Africa. I'll be there on Friday, the end of this week, the 27th, 28th. Single occupancy, when you're trying to go on vacation, is way more expensive than double occupancy. I want to pay the family rate. I want the Marsh family rate, family of one. And then what everybody understands, whether or not you're in America or the global South, is the tax structure. There is a penalty built into the tax, a singlehood penalty built into the tax structure. So I want us to think about whether or not we should evolve the term family to include people that are single and living alone in the conversation. If you are emphatic that it shouldn't be, is it because you have some negative views and you have a stigma towards singles, or do you have an articulate answer as to why we shouldn't broaden the term family to include people that are single and living alone? If you don't want to use the word family for singles and living alone, also to the point that I keep making, how friends play a central role. I think these non-romantic nurturing relationships can also be developed into a family and be identified as a family and get the benefits that come from a family. So that's something I want people to think about. I get a lot of pushback about that, but at least it makes you think and makes you pause for a second.
All right. Thank you, Doc. And maybe one last question, two more actually. Maybe you can try and answer each in 30 seconds.
Okay.
The first one is maybe outside of your book now. As an author, obviously, you have some of your favorite books, perhaps, that have made a significant impact in your life or even in your research. Maybe one or two titles?
So anything by Julie Glamini. She is I'm a huge fan of hers. And she wrote a book a couple of years ago. I'm blanking on the title now. And there's two women on the cover of it. I can see the title. I can see the book. I can't see the title. I'm a big fan of Julie Glamini's work, and I followed her. She's got something else that's coming out soon. So because I'm an American, I think it's really important for me to learn from other countries and other contexts. So I don't want to just draw from American scholars. And I've learned so much from her, and I appreciate her. I also think that anything on the Black middle class, whether or not it's here, whether or not, because one of my colleagues, Grace, in South Africa, she's written on the Black middle class. Anybody that writes the Black middle class, I'm definitely there for it. And I want to use that and incorporate that into my scholarship.
What I wanted to know as the last question from my side is, when all is said and done, perhaps due to your work that you have done through your research academically and even with your book, because a book basically makes you immortal. But the question was, when all is said and done, what would you like to be remembered for as Dr. Kris Marsh?
Oh, wow. That is a loaded question. And I'm not sure that I have like the best answer. So let me answer it in two ways. So if we think about this book in particular, when it's all said and done, I hope that people really do embrace singlehood and they embrace people that are single. And one of the things I say in the book, and I stand by this, is after reading the book, I hope you're just as likely to ask somebody, why are you single? As you ask somebody, why are you married? We often ask single folks, why are you single? But we don't ask married folks the same question. So after reading this book, one way to destigmatize singlehood is to ask everybody. Don't just ask single folks. So I really hope the book does that. And I really hope that when it's all said and done, I really can broaden the perspective of us under thinking about Black love, thinking about Black families, and thinking about singles being a central part of that conversation. So that's what I hope the book does. All of the books that I plan, a couple of books that I plan to write from here on out, again, gets back to the point I was making at the beginning of the podcast, that I'm really interested in understanding the Black middle class. We often talk about the Black poor, but there's not just a Black poor. There is a Black middle class. So when you say Blacks, you're going to have to clarify which part of Black you're talking about. Black people. Are you talking about poor Black people? You're talking about middle class Black people? You're talking about elite Black people? Because you can't just lump them all into one category, because we're not a monolith. We're not a monolithic. We're just not. So that's my research, my body of research. And at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, me being a professor, me being a scholar, me have written many books, I want people to say that Kris or Dr. Marsh was always unapologetically Black. I'm always cheering for Blackness, for Black people. One of the things I even said in the book is I said, this is a politics of citation. I'm talking about Black people, Black scholars who have written about Black families. I don't want to talk about white scholars who have made their entire career and in some ways have become the experts on Black family. I'm going to cite Black scholars talk about Black families. So at the end of the day, I am unapologetically Black. And that's what I absolutely want people to take away from what I've left here when I'm long gone.
Absolutely inspiring. Thank you, Dr. Kris. I'm sure there are Black brothers and sisters are like, yes, power to that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for honoring this invite. And I'm sure even if someone don't go through the books, they've got like the gist of what you are trying to accomplish with your work. So that was brilliantly done. And I'm so grateful that you took your time and be part of this conversation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this conversation. Thank you for joining in. And please, if you are new or you haven't subscribed to the channel, do the right thing. Subscribe and hit that bell so that you can be notified when the new episode is uploaded on YouTube. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Kris. Bye.
Thank you.